Heidi Rathjen of the gun control organization PolySeSouvient recently did a couple of interviews with both CTV and Global News where she ramped up the rhetoric and the lies in order to encourage the government to ban the SKS. Let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be taking a look at a couple of interviews that Heidi Rathjen did with CTV and Global News. Now, I first saw both of these interviews on X, one from the CCFR and the other from the NFA's Tom Mavin, and I have three pretty serious grievances with what she said during these interviews. We're primarily going to be focusing on the CTV interview because both interviews say basically the same thing, but there was something kind of interesting that Heidi admitted to in her interview with Global, and that was specifically as to whether or not these gun bans target hunting rifles or not. She also cited some deceptive stats which I think need to be debunked, and the biggest of these ridiculous claims is that the majority of firearms used in crime, nationally, are domestically sourced, meaning that they have some manner of lawful origin.
What needs to be understood, though, is that the gun lobby and the conservative governments are going around quoting 80% of gun crime is committed with illegal handguns, for example. That is not true. The 80 or 90% applies to handguns only and urban crime only. And it's true that in places like Toronto, 80% of gun crime is committed with illegal handguns. However, across the country, these are RCMP numbers. They did a study over 4 years of guns seized in crime. Most are domestically sourced, 73%, and most are long guns.
Of course, it would shock no one who actually knows anything about the firearms debate in Canada that this is just not true. For starters, there was no 4-year study that proved any of her claims. Because with the help of the CCFR, it was actually quite easy to trace this claim back to Poly's website. And even on their website, that number is not 73%, it's 68%. Now that in itself is a relatively minor gripe, but it's a start. The 73% number represents a different claim, which we'll get into in a few minutes here. But even based on the 68% claim, this wasn't a study or anything even remotely approaching that. This was actually from something called an inquiry of ministry, which is basically sort of like an ATIP, but for parliamentarians. In this case, Conservative MP Randy Hoback formally asked Public Safety some questions which were primarily related to the source or the origin of firearms, which were traced by the RCMP's National Firearm Tracing Center. The response came from our old friend Pam Damoff, and she was only able to provide answers in 2 of the 4 years. Although, to be fair, it looks like the information was only actually available in those 2 years, so it's not like she was hiding any information. So that's the so-called 4-year study that Heidi was citing here. It was just a routine Q&A in Parliament. Now, in the 2 years for which the information was actually reported, it breaks the information down fairly significantly by different types of firearms, as well as by RCMP traces, CBSA traces, and all other police traces, which came through the Canadian National Firearms Tracing Center. However, it's worth noting that this is far from the only firearms tracing center in Canada, so despite Heidi's claims, it's also not really representative of national numbers. Another issue here is that the RCMP traces account for the majority of the bandwidth in this inquiry. And being that the RCMP doesn't generally operate within cities, any results in this inquiry are going to be disproportionately rural results. And this is despite the fact that over 75% of firearm-related violent crimes typically happen within urban areas and not rural ones, at least according to Juristat. And as if all of that wasn't enough, the tracing isn't even segregated by firearms which are either seized, surrendered, or found, meaning that within these traces there are also tons of firearms which have never been used in any kind of crime ever. Not even a paperwork crime, let alone some kind of violent crime like a robbery, assault, or homicide. More on that in a moment. Worse still, this inquiry also demonstrates rather clearly that of the firearms which are in some way seized by the RCMP or other police services, only an incredibly small fraction of them are actually traced, which further brings the validity of these numbers into question. Depending on how you want to break down the data, the traced firearms can account for less than 5% of the total firearms seized in any given year. And you can probably expect that a huge number of these untraced ones are illegal firearms. Like, there probably isn't much point in wasting the resources on a trace of something like a subcompact handgun, because you already know that such firearms have been prohibited in Canada since 1998. So yeah, the results of this inquiry by Randy Hoback aren't exactly worthless, but they represent a pretty severely biased and incomplete sample which should be taken with a really heavy grain of salt. Like, it's unbelievably dishonest and irresponsible to take its results simply at face value, or worse, to go around branding this as some kind of so-called study and then trying to pass it off as some kind of national metric which is representative of the truth. And this gets us to the actual origin of the 73% claim. So the 73% number comes from discussions in SecU on December 16th from 2021. And it was brought up by then Commissioner of the RCMP, Brenda Lucki, who is well known in our community for being just a bastion of integrity and truth towards Canadian gun owners. And she said that of the firearms which can be positively traced, 73% of them originate in Canada. But she also said that this number is only 58% of all traced firearms, including those of unknown origins, so that's already a fair bit smaller. And we can also presume that right off the top here, Lucki is lying, go figure, because 27% and 73% is a total of 100%. But not all of the firearms that are smuggled into Canada come directly from the States. Only about 90% of the firearms actually come from the States, according to the CBSA. So if Brenda Lucki is considering only Canadian or American firearms instead of domestic versus non-domestic firearms, she's also diluting the total further in order to artificially inflate the lawful Canadian proportion. But later that day, the Director General of the Canadian Firearms Program, Kelly Paquette, had more specifics on where that number comes from. Here she says that this number comes from very specifically the National Firearms Tracing Center, which is again just one tracing center and is not representative of national numbers. But if we check out the Commissioner of RCMP's reports, we can learn one last very important number about these traces. We don't have this information in 2021 and earlier, but in the reports from 2022 to 2024, roughly 60% of the firearms traced by the National Center each year are crime guns, meaning that 40% of the firearms they trace are firearms which have never been used or even suspected of being involved in a crime. Which means these are normal firearms that are surrendered for various other reasons as a standard part of the enforcement of the Firearms Act. Like, for example, if someone passes away and there's no one around to inherit their firearms, those firearms are then confiscated and traced before they are destroyed, but they're not crime guns. But even if you come back to the remaining 60%, which are within the category of crime guns, it counts paperwork crimes as well. Because crime guns were officially defined in 2021, which is why we don't have any information on them before that time, but the definition would include things like unsafe storage, expiry of licenses, and also just any firearms which are suspected of being used in a crime, even when that doesn't end up being true. So if you further whittle down the remaining percentage of domestically sourced firearms to include only violent criminal offenses, and then you begin including the other 90 to 95% of firearms that they aren't even bothering to trace, I would imagine you start seeing much closer to the 80 to 90% that we, and most police forces, are usually talking about.
What's causing the most harm on our streets are illegal firearms, and I would say if not 99% of them we can identify from the US, the other percentage is just because they're unidentifiable.
So the 73% number cited by Heidi and Brenda Lucki isn't exactly technically a lie per se, but it's wildly disingenuous to suggest that it somehow represents any kind of national metric on criminally sourced firearms. It is a heavily curated number from a radically incomplete and biased sample set, which is how these things usually go. Like when the gun control types tell you how things are or aren't in Canada, you don't even really need to argue with them. All you need to do is just check their homework, just verify what they're saying. Because they're gonna be lying, or at the very least, grossly misrepresenting the truth. All you have to do is just follow the breadcrumbs that they've left for you. And speaking of grossly misrepresenting the truth, Heidi made another egregious claim in her interviews, specifically about why we need to ban the SKS. Because the tale they're now spinning is that the SKS can be turned into a quasi-AR-15, and that these modern versions are somehow more dangerous based on the AR-15-iness of these modified SKSs.
There's also another gun that your group is advocating go on that list of banned weapons, the SKS.
At the very least, ban new sales of SKS so that new assault weapons don't come on the market. And then we'll deal with those that exist. We propose to at least remove from circulation modern versions, which, I mean, gun experts and gun enthusiasts, they call them quasi-AR-14s. These have to be removed from circulation. And for the older versions, we're okay with having a special exemption where they can remain in circulation in the hands of their owners. In other words, be subject to grandfather clauses.
First off, she couldn't even be bothered to remember the name of the poster child of their gun control agenda. She called it an AR-14. And this wasn't just a one-off either, because she also got tripped up on it during her interview with Global News. Now, normally I don't get bogged down in semantics like this because I think it weakens our own arguments, but that's a pretty shocking thing for a leader of the gun control community to be struggling with.
There are modern versions, and the modern versions resemble very closely. I mean, they even call them quasi-AR-15s.
Now, the supposed basis for this is the concern that these modern SKSs are somehow more dangerous than the traditional versions. Like, Poly even has a brief on this on their website where it says that they're concerned about these dangerous modern assault weapon capabilities like folding stocks.
Terrible, this is one of the worst catastrophes in the world over humanity.
They also mentioned that modern SKSs can have a bayonet, but their own brief shows that all SKSs, even in their default traditional configuration, have bayonets. Like, that's not a modern thing. Poly even put out a quote on X citing from this document where they show Ian McCollum from the Forgotten Weapons YouTube channel showcasing how an SKS can be turned into an AR-15-like firearm with a stock replacement kit. So what that means is that if you remove the wooden stock and put on a composite stock, I guess that apparently activates like the turbo mode on the firearm, and that makes the gun too dangerous for civilians to own. But it's also a curious thing, and I even directly called them out on X for this, but Forgotten Weapons expert Ian McCollum is also on record stating very clearly that AR-15s are not assault rifles, and that so-called assault weapon bans, in particular the one which happened in the United States, that these assault weapon bans are based on banning firearms solely on a black, scary cosmetic appearance, rather than any kind of objective definition. Do you suppose that Poly's going to take his expertise on that as well? Or are experts only experts when they say something that fits their gun control agenda?
A semi-automatic rifle that meets the other two criteria, like a semi-auto AR-15, does not meet the criteria. That is not an assault rifle. What they were trying to do is take a scary military phrase and apply it to not scary, well, or potentially scary appearing civilian firearms that they wanted to restrict or prohibit.
And then Tom Mavin of the NFA also rightly called out Poly for the reasoning on banning these so-called modern SKSs, pointing to the fact that these stock transitions are primarily cosmetic. They're not actually a change in the firearm's capabilities, further reinforcing our claims that the government and the gun control lobby are just interested in banning things which are scary looking. This is about politics, not public safety. However, in his shared interview from Global News, Heidi had something rather interesting here to say about the SKS specifically.
The SKS is a special case, that's for sure, because while it is literally an assault weapon, it was designed by the Soviets for the war of the Second World War. It is also, because it was dumped in large numbers, surpluses were dumped very cheap in Canada after the Second World War. It is here in large numbers, and many hunters use them. So it's both an assault weapon and a hunting gun.
So it's both an assault weapon and a hunting gun? Now that's a rather interesting admission. So assault weapons can also be hunting guns then. Like, just because a firearm may have military origins, that does not preclude it from being also a hunting rifle. The guns that we've been saying for years that are hunting and sporting rifles can in fact still be hunting and sporting rifles even if they were originally designed for military use. It is very interesting for her to actually admit that, because that's been the core fundamental denial of their gun control rhetoric since its inception. And not only that, but there are tons of hunting and sporting rifles on the ban list which have never seen military use anywhere in the world ever. And they're actually wildly inappropriate and inadequate for those uses. And this was confirmed recently by Ukraine itself when Canada offered it the firearms on the ban list for free, and Ukraine rejected the offer, saying that these firearms couldn't really be of any use in their war efforts. And this is because they're actually hunting and sporting firearms, not weapons of war, as the gun control types are desperate to make people believe. Now, in her interview, Heidi did say something which we could perhaps maybe say is, I don't know, commendable? Like, we always hear that we need to ban these assault-style firearms in order to get these guns off of our streets, and Heidi certainly did also say that in this interview as well. But she started off with a different tone. She started by making an important distinction about their specific goal with assault-style gun control.
Banning assault weapons targets one specific misuse of guns, which is mass shootings. And nobody's ever said that banning assault weapons will solve the illegal handgun issue. But if we want to prevent mass shootings, where most of the time in Canada and the United States, the mass shooter is the legal owner of the guns used. This was the case at Polytechnique, at Dawson, at the Quebec Mosque, numerous times when police officers were shot, including 3 in Moncton, 3 RCMP officers. They're shot with legal assault weapons. So banning assault weapons is the first thing to do if we don't want to go down the road of the United States where they have a mass shooting every single day.
Now, I called that an important distinction because we always see the gun control types conflating all forms of gun control as a generic public safety measure. That this confiscation program is going to make women and children safer, or that it'll reduce other kinds of crime like intimate partner violence and gang crime. And politicians and gun control types have been spreading these lies for years, and it even came up in multiple different places in the CCFR's court rulings. Like, if we're going to have a conversation about mass casualty incidents and the role that firearms may or may not play in those, that's one thing. But any attempt to insinuate that banning a specific kind of firearm, or even all firearms, that this will somehow reduce violent crime generically is just, it's beyond ridiculous. But even within the mass casualty incident angle, it's mostly based on lies. Like, Heidi claimed that most of these MCIs are committed with lawfully owned assault weapons, which is untrue on every level. It's also not true that most MCIs are committed by lawfully owned firearms in Canada. It's also not true that MCIs are most commonly committed by assault weapons or even firearms. And it's also not true that not banning these firearms will somehow cause Canada to end up like the United States, which is a mainstay justification for more gun control in Canada. And then Heidi also recently wrote an article in La Presse where she fear-mongered about us becoming like the States if we don't ban all assault weapons, including the SKS. But there is a fundamental problem with this rhetoric, because saying that we might become like the States is a direct admission that we are already nothing like the States. Our current laws are already extremely effective at preventing firearm-related MCIs, particularly our licensing scheme and red flag laws, which, by the way, existed long before Trudeau pretended to bring them in. What we need is to enforce our current laws, not create new ones, because a number of the most prolific MCIs since 1995 could have and would have been prevented if law enforcement acted within their already existing authorities to investigate impending misuse. But there's also a logical fallacy involved in holding Canadians responsible not just for the evils of other Canadians, but particularly for the evils of other peoples around the world. For example, let's take a look at this reasoning if you apply it to something which is not firearm related. Let's talk about everyone's favorite analogy, cars. Let's suppose you are in charge of creating speed limits for the highways in Canada. Suppose that, since time immemorial, there have been no speed limits on any highways anywhere in Canada. Sure, it can cause collisions, but it's been the case for generations that people desire the freedom to drive as fast as they want, more than they value the safety provided by enacting speed limits. And then 2009 comes around and you hear about a massive 259 car pileup which happened on Germany's Autobahn, leaving dozens of people critically injured. And being that you're in charge of Canada's highways, you say, enough is enough. And you say that in order to protect Canadians, some basic common sense highway speed limits around 110 kilometers per hour are going to be implemented and enforced nationwide. Okay, fair enough. But then 2 years later in 2011, another massive pileup on the Autobahn happens and it results in 10 fatalities and 74 injuries. Being that you're oh so concerned about public safety, you further reduce the speed limit from 110 kilometers an hour down to 80 kilometers per hour in order to ensure that no such tragedies can happen in Canada. But then again, at some point down the road, Germany's Autobahn has another huge pileup with 8 fatalities, 130 injuries. So you use this once again as evidence to say that enough is enough. Canadian drivers cannot be trusted on Canadian roads, and you go even further this time, reducing the speed limits on highways to 50 kilometers per hour, and you ban high-velocity sports cars because, after all, who needs a high-velocity sports car anyway? But once again, at some point down the road, Germany has yet another pileup on the Autobahn, resulting in many more injuries and fatalities. And then you once again use this as justification to further punish Canadian drivers for it. So hopefully you can understand the inherent flaw in this reasoning. Like, if the benchmark for whether or not your policies are working is a place that is outside of your jurisdiction, then your policies can never ever be enough. Likewise with firearms, if the benchmark for whether or not we need more gun control is evidence from another country that has minimal gun control, such as the States, then we will always need more gun control until, or even after, every single firearm is banned. Restricting or eliminating the freedoms of Canadians based on another country that may or may not have a gun problem is no different than implementing crippling speed limits or prohibiting certain kinds of vehicles on the rationale that Germany has no speed limits on its Autobahn. This kind of rhetoric is normalized in the gun control narrative, but if you actually tried to justify speed restrictions and car bans in real life based on this Autobahn analogy, people would probably accuse you of being mentally ill, and rightly so. Speaking of which, that actually gives me a good idea for a follow-up video. All that being said, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.